In a modest Alabama home, a 73-year-old grandmother was about to shatter 7 decades of silence. What started as a simple Sunday dinner took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her granddaughter's familiar words. "I'm just not good enough for anything." Anna Charlotte Williams wasn't your typical Southern grandmother. For 70 years, she had carried the devastating secret of being abandoned by her own parents at age 3, sent away because they desperately wanted a son to inherit their struggling farm, not a daughter they saw as a burden. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Anna Charlotte's front porch as she watched her granddaughter push green beans around her plate with the determination of someone trying to avoid conversation. The weekly Sunday dinner that had once filled her modest Alabama home with laughter now felt heavy with unspoken tension, each family member moving carefully around Sophie's fragile state, like dancers avoiding broken glass. Anna Charlotte's weathered hands smoothed the worn fabric of her church dress as she observed the familiar choreography of avoidance playing out before her. Maggie sat rigidly beside her daughter, her lawyer's composure barely masking the helpless frustration that had been building for weeks. Emma, 14 and usually bubbling with stories from school, picked at her cornbread in unusual silence, stealing worried glances at her older sister. David, bless his patient soul, was making his third attempt to engage Sophie in conversation about her upcoming English assignment, his voice gentle but increasingly strained. "The essay's due Tuesday, isn't it, sweetheart?" he asked, cutting his ham with deliberate precision. Mrs. Henderson always did appreciate thoughtful analysis. "Remember when you wrote that piece about To Kill a Mockingbird last year?" She called it. "I'm not going to write it," Sophie interrupted, her voice flat and distant. She set down her fork with a finality that made everyone freeze. "What's the point? I'll just mess it up anyway." "I mess everything up." The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, acrid and suffocating. Anna Charlotte felt something crack deep in her chest, a sound like ice breaking on a winter pond. She had heard that exact tone before, had seen that same defeated slump of shoulders, that particular way of making oneself small in the world. It was a look she knew intimately, one that had stared back at her from mirrors for 70 years. "Sophie, honey, that's not true," Maggie said, reaching for her daughter's hand. But Sophie pulled away, the movement sharp enough to make her water glass tremble. "It is true, Mom. I didn't make cheerleading. I'm barely keeping my GPA up. I can't even order food at restaurants without messing up." Sophie's voice began to crack, and Anna Charlotte watched her granddaughter's face crumple the way young faces do when they're trying desperately not to cry. "I'm just not good enough for anything. I don't know why you all keep pretending otherwise." The last words came out as barely a whisper, but they might as well have been shouted. Sophie pushed back from the table with enough force to make the dishes rattle, and fled toward the front door, letting the screen slam behind her with a sound like a gunshot. In the ensuing silence, Anna Charlotte could hear the old porch swing creaking as Sophie likely threw herself onto it, and the evening cicadas beginning their ancient song. She could also hear Maggie's sharp intake of breath, the kind that preceded either tears or an explosion of parental panic. "I should go to her," Maggie said, already half standing, but Anna Charlotte's voice stopped her. "Let her be for a moment," Anna Charlotte said quietly. The words came from some deep well of understanding she hadn't expected to access. Sometimes, a person needs to sit with their hurt before they can let someone else help carry it. David's hand found hers across the table, his thumb tracing the familiar pattern of her wedding ring. 52 years of marriage had taught him to read the subtle shifts in her breathing, the way her shoulders carried invisible weight. "Anna Charlotte?" he asked softly. "What is it?" She looked at her husband's kind, lined face, then at Maggie's stricken expression, then at Emma's wide eyes that seemed far too knowing for 14. 3 generations of women, and here they were, sitting in the same suffocating silence that had defined her entire life. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent decades trying to protect her family from the pain of her past, only to watch it manifest anyway in her granddaughter's defeated posture. She sounds just like me, Anna Charlotte admitted, the words feeling foreign and dangerous on her tongue. When I was her age. When I was any age, really. Maggie's lawyer instincts sharpened, focusing on her mother with the intensity she usually reserved for cross-examinations. What do you mean? But Anna Charlotte couldn't answer, not yet. The weight of 70 years of silence pressed against her throat like a physical thing. Instead, she stood and began clearing plates with the methodical precision of someone who had been managing family crises through ritual for decades. The familiar motions, scraping, stacking, wiping, gave her hands something to do while her mind raced. "I'll talk to her," Maggie said, standing as well. "Maybe Dr. Peterson can see her this week. Or that counselor the school recommended." "This isn't something a stranger can fix," Anna Charlotte interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. She set the stack of plates down and looked directly at her daughter. "Some things run deeper than that." The conversation died there, strangled by the weight of all the things Anna Charlotte had never said. They finished cleaning in near silence, Emma helping with the dishes while making occasional comments about her upcoming history test that felt forced and hollow. Maggie kept glancing toward the front porch where Sophie remained, clearly torn between her mother's advice to wait and her own desperate need to fix whatever was breaking her daughter. When the last dish was dried and put away, the family dispersed with the careful politeness of people avoiding a conversation no one knew how to have. Maggie eventually coaxed Sophie into the car with promises of stopping for ice cream on the way home, though Anna Charlotte doubted either of them would actually eat it. Emma hugged her grandmother with unusual fierceness before following her mother and sister into the gathering twilight. David settled into his evening routine of watching the news and working on the crossword puzzle that came in Sunday's paper, his presence steady and comforting as always. But Anna Charlotte found herself unable to sit still. She moved through her house like a restless spirit, straightening things that didn't need straightening, checking locks that were already secure, her mind caught in an endless loop of Sophie's words. "I'm just not good enough for anything." The girl had no idea how those words echoed across decades, how they landed in Anna Charlotte's chest like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples through memories she had worked so hard to bury. She had spent her entire adult life trying to ensure her children, and their children, would never feel the particular brand of unworthiness that had shaped her existence. She had been patient when she wanted to push, present when she wanted to retreat, loving when love felt like the most dangerous thing in the world. And yet here was Sophie, carrying the same wound anyway. Later that night, as Anna Charlotte lay beside David in the bed they had shared for over 5 decades, she listened to his steady breathing and felt the weight of her decisions settling over her like a heavy quilt. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed 11:47 p.m., then 11:48, then 11:49, marking time with the relentless patience of something that had witnessed countless nights of sleepless wrestling with conscience. "David?" she whispered into the darkness. "Hmm?" His response was drowsy but attentive, the sound of a man who had learned long ago that middle-of-the-night conversations in their house usually meant something important. "What if I told you that everything you know about my childhood is a lie?" The question hung between them in the darkness, and Anna Charlotte felt her husband's body grow still beside her. After a long moment, he turned to face her, his hand finding hers beneath the covers. "Then I'd say it's time you told me the truth," he said simply. Anna Charlotte squeezed his fingers and stared at the ceiling, where shadows from the old oak tree outside their window danced in patterns that looked like reaching arms. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she would call Maggie and ask her to come for tea. Tomorrow she would begin the conversation that should have happened 70 years ago. The thought terrified her. But watching Sophie disappear into the same darkness that had swallowed her own childhood terrified her more. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Anna Charlotte's kitchen as she stared at the phone in her hand, David's words from the night before still echoing in her mind. "Then I'd say it's time you told me the truth." She had barely slept, her body alternating between bone-deep exhaustion and electric anxiety, as if her nervous system couldn't decide whether to shut down or prepare for battle. David had already left for his morning walk, a routine that had become more important since his heart attack 2 years ago. The quiet rhythm of his footsteps on the front porch, the gentle click of the screen door, the way he hummed old hymns under his breath as he made his way down their tree-lined street. All of it felt precious and fragile this morning, weighted with the knowledge that everything was about to change. Anna Charlotte's finger hovered over Maggie's contact information. Monday morning, 9:15 a.m. Her daughter would be in her downtown Birmingham office by now, probably already 3 cups of coffee deep into reviewing contracts or preparing for depositions. Maggie had inherited Anna Charlotte's work ethic but amplified it through years of proving herself in a male-dominated profession, creating a life of structured control that Anna Charlotte recognized as its own form of armor. The phone felt impossibly heavy in her hand. 70 years of silence had a weight to it, a gravitational pull that made the simplest actions, like dialing her own daughter's number, feel like moving mountains. But then she thought of Sophie's face at dinner, the way her granddaughter had seemed to fold in on herself like a flower closing against harsh light. That look of fundamental unworthiness, as if she were apologizing for taking up space in the world. Anna Charlotte knew that look intimately, had seen it in mirrors, in family photographs where she stood slightly apart from the others, in the careful way she had learned to make herself small and grateful and never, ever demanding. Her finger pressed the call button. "Mom?" Maggie's voice carried the subtle tension it always held when Anna Charlotte called during work hours. Not irritation exactly, but a kind of anticipatory worry, as if she expected emergencies. "Is everything okay? Is Dad?" "Your father's fine," Anna Charlotte said quickly. "He's on his walk. I was wondering, could you come by this afternoon? For tea?" The words felt rusty in her mouth, unpracticed. When was the last time she had asked Maggie to simply visit, without the framework of a holiday or family obligation? There was a pause, long enough for Anna Charlotte to hear the familiar sounds of Maggie's office in the background, the distant hum of conversation, the clicking of keyboards, the efficient bustle of people who believed problems could be solved through careful analysis and strategic thinking. "Tea?" Maggie repeated, as if she'd never heard the word before. "Just tea? I have something I need to tell you. Something important." Anna Charlotte's voice caught slightly on the word important, betraying more emotion than she'd intended. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Another pause, longer this time. Anna Charlotte could practically hear her daughter's mind racing, that quick legal intelligence trying to categorize this unusual request, searching for precedent in their relationship and finding none. "Mom, you're scaring me. Are you sick? Is it serious?" "No, honey. I'm not sick." Anna Charlotte twisted her wedding ring around her finger, a nervous habit she'd developed decades ago. "But this conversation? It's overdue. Has been for about 70 years, if I'm being honest. 70 years. Now Maggie's voice carried a different kind of concern, the careful tone people used when they suspected someone might be experiencing confusion or memory loss. "Mom, you're 73. What could you possibly need to tell me about something that happened when you were 3 years old?" The question hung in the air between them, and Anna Charlotte felt the familiar urge to retreat, to smooth things over with some benign explanation and return to the safe territory of weather and weekend plans. It would be so easy to laugh it off, to say she was being dramatic, to let the moment pass like so many others had over the decades. Instead, she thought of Sophie again. "Everything," she said quietly. "I need to tell you everything." The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses. Deeper, charged with the weight of recognition. Maggie might not understand what was happening, but her instincts were too sharp to miss the gravity in her mother's voice. "I can be there by 4, Maggie said finally. "Should I bring the girls?" Anna Charlotte's breath caught. This was the moment of no return. The choice between telling her story to one person or beginning the process that would eventually include them all. But Sophie's pain was too fresh, too urgent, and Emma deserved to understand why her family carried sadness like a genetic trait. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Bring Sophie and Emma. They need to hear this too." "Mom, what's going on? You're really starting to worry me. Is this about yesterday? About Sophie? I know she's struggling, but it's about all of us," Anna Charlotte interrupted gently. "About why Sophie is struggling. About why you've spent your whole life trying to be perfect. About why She paused, searching for words that could encompass a lifetime of emotional distance without sounding like an accusation. "About why I've never been the mother you deserved." The words hung between them like a bridge partially built, spanning a chasm, but not quite reaching the other side. Anna Charlotte could hear Maggie's sharp intake of breath, could almost feel her daughter's mind scrambling to process this unexpected vulnerability. "Mom, that's not. You are a good mother. You are a good mother." "I was a careful mother," Anna Charlotte corrected softly. "There's a difference." She could hear Maggie moving in her office, probably closing her door, creating privacy for a conversation that was veering into territory they had never explored together. Anna Charlotte pictured her daughter's face, the way Maggie's brow would furrow when she was trying to solve a particularly complex problem, the slight tightening around her eyes that appeared when she was fighting emotion. "4 o'clock, Maggie said finally. "I'll pick up the girls from school and bring them directly over. Should I prepare them somehow? Tell them this is important?" Anna Charlotte considered this. How do you prepare children for the revelation that their grandmother's entire life story has been a carefully constructed fiction? How do you warn them that family truth can be both liberation and devastation? "Just tell them we're going to have a family conversation," she said. Tell them their grandmother has been carrying a secret for a very long time, and it's time to share it." After they hung up, Anna Charlotte sat in her kitchen for a long time, staring at the phone in her hands. Outside, she could hear the familiar sounds of her neighborhood stirring to life. Lawnmowers starting up, children playing in yards, the distant hum of traffic on the main road. Normal sounds of normal lives, carrying on without the knowledge that in a few hours, one family's understanding of itself would be fundamentally altered. She thought about the tea service she would use, her grandmother's china, the delicate cups with tiny roses painted around the rim. The irony wasn't lost on her that she would be serving tea in dishes that had belonged to the woman who had raised her after her parents sent her away. Aunt Beulah's china, witness to countless family gatherings where the most important truths remained carefully unspoken. David would be home from his walk soon, and she would need to tell him about the afternoon's plans. He had waited 52 years for this conversation. He deserved more than a few hours' notice that it was finally happening. But first, she had to figure out how to begin a story that had no good beginning. Only a 3-year-old girl who disappeared one day and spent the rest of her life trying to understand why she wasn't enough to make her parents want to keep her. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10 times, each note falling into the quiet house like stones dropped into deep water. Anna Charlotte Williams took a deep breath, tasted the weight of truth on her tongue, and began to prepare for the most important conversation of her life. By 4 o'clock, Anna Charlotte had rearranged the living room furniture 3 times. The afternoon light slanted through the windows at exactly the angle that made the worn spots on the sofa cushions most visible, and she found herself adjusting throw pillows with the desperate precision of someone trying to control the uncontrollable. The tea service sat on the coffee table like an altar. Aunt Beulah's rose-patterned china arranged with military precision, the pound cake she'd baked that morning already sliced and waiting on the tiered serving plate that only emerged for special occasions. David watched her nervous preparations with the patient understanding of a man who had learned to read his wife's anxiety in the set of her shoulders, the way she worried her wedding ring when she thought no one was looking. He had returned from his walk to find her in a state of controlled panic, moving through the house like a woman preparing for either a celebration or a funeral. "Anna Charlotte," he said gently, catching her hand as she reached to straighten the sugar bowl for the 4th time. "It's going to be all right." She looked at him with eyes that held 7 decades of carefully contained fear. "How can you be so sure?" "Because the hardest part, the deciding, is already done," he said, his thumb tracing the familiar pattern of lines on her palm. "Everything else is just words." The sound of Maggie's car in the driveway sent a jolt of electricity through Anna Charlotte's chest. She moved to the front window and watched as her daughter emerged from the driver's seat, with the purposeful efficiency that characterized all her movements. Maggie wore her armor today, a crisp navy suit that projected competence and control, her hair pulled back in the kind of severe bun she favored for difficult court cases. Even from a distance, Anna Charlotte could see the tension in her daughter's posture, the way she moved like someone bracing for impact. Sophie unfolded herself from the passenger seat, with the languid reluctance of a teenager who had been conscripted rather than invited. Her school uniform was wrinkled, her backpack slung over one shoulder with studied carelessness, but Anna Charlotte could see the curiosity flickering behind her granddaughter's defensive facade. Emma bounced out of the back seat with her characteristic energy, chattering about something that made Maggie's tight expression soften slightly. The front door opened to admit a small parade of uncertainty. Emma bounded in first, her face bright with the kind of anticipation that comes from sensing adult secrets without understanding their weight. "Grandma, Mom said you have something super important to tell us. Is it about Christmas? Are we getting a puppy? Sophie said you might be sick, but you look fine to me." Emma's words tumbled over each other in a rush of nervous energy that filled the room with motion. Sophie followed more slowly, her teenage armor of indifference not quite concealing the vulnerability that had been so raw the day before. She offered Anna Charlotte a small smile that felt like a peace offering, an acknowledgement that yesterday's pain hadn't been directed at her grandmother specifically, but at the world in general. Maggie entered last, closing the door with the careful precision of someone who understood that whatever happened in the next few hours would change things irrevocably. She had clearly spent the drive from Birmingham trying to prepare her daughters for something she didn't understand herself, and the effort showed in the tight lines around her eyes. "Thank you for coming," Anna Charlotte said, the formality of her words sounding strange even to her own ears. This was her family, her daughter and granddaughters, people who belonged in her living room. Yet today felt different, charged with the weight of approaching revelation. They settled into their familiar positions. Maggie on the edge of the sofa as if ready to spring into action, Sophie curled into the corner chair with her legs tucked under her, Emma cross-legged on the floor despite the availability of perfectly good furniture. David took his usual spot in the recliner, close enough to offer support but far enough away to give Anna Charlotte space to tell her story in her own way. The ritual of serving tea provided a few more minutes of normalcy. Anna Charlotte's hands moved through the familiar motions, pouring the amber liquid into delicate cups, passing the cream and sugar, offering slices of pound cake that no one seemed particularly interested in eating. The china clinked softly against the saucers, a gentle percussion that filled the growing silence. "Mom," Maggie said finally, setting down her untouched tea. "What's this about?" Anna Charlotte remained standing, her own cup trembling slightly in her hands. She had rehearsed this moment countless times since morning, but now that it was here, all her carefully planned words seemed to evaporate. "How do you begin a story that challenges everything your family believes about who you are?" The sound of footsteps on the front porch provided an unexpected reprieve. Anna Charlotte froze, recognizing the gentle knock that followed. 3 soft taps, a pause, then 2 more. Reverend Michael Torres, arriving with the impeccable timing that had made him such a valued counselor to his congregation over the years. "Excuse me for just a moment," Anna Charlotte murmured, grateful for the interruption even as her hands shook with nerves. She opened the door to find Reverend Michael standing on her porch with his familiar expression of calm concern. He was a man in his 50s who carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to sitting with people in their darkest hours. His presence had a grounding effect, as if he brought some of the sanctuary's peace with him wherever he went. "Anna Charlotte," he said softly, "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I've been thinking about our conversation this morning, and I felt called to be here." She had called him after her conversation with Maggie, needing spiritual counsel for what she was about to attempt. Reverend Michael had listened without judgment as she explained, in the vaguest terms, that she was preparing to share a family secret that had been buried for 7 decades. He had offered to come, to provide support and guidance for what promised to be a difficult conversation, and she had gratefully accepted. "Please come in," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. I think I'm going to need all the help I can get." The family looked up with varying degrees of surprise and confusion as Reverend Michael entered the living room. Emma waved enthusiastically. She had always been fond of the minister who told the best stories during children's sermons. Sophie offered a polite nod, while Maggie's lawyer instincts sharpened visibly at this unexpected addition to what was supposed to be a family conversation. "Reverend Torres," Maggie said carefully, "this is unexpected." "I asked him to come," Anna Charlotte said, her voice steadier now with his calming presence in the room. "What I'm about to tell you, it's not easy to hear, or to say. I thought we might benefit from some spiritual guidance." She gestured for Reverend Michael to take a seat, and he settled onto the piano bench with the easy familiarity of someone who had spent countless hours in this house over the years. His presence shifted the energy in the room, lending weight and ceremony to what was about to unfold. Anna Charlotte returned to her position near the fireplace, her teacup now abandoned on the mantel. The late afternoon light streaming through the windows created a natural spotlight around her, and she felt the full attention of 5 people who loved her focusing like a beam. "I need to tell you all about the day I died," she began, her voice clear and steady despite the tremor in her hands. The words fell into the room like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of confusion and concern. Emma's eyes widened with the kind of fascination children reserve for ghost stories, while Sophie sat up straighter, her teenage detachment replaced by genuine attention. Maggie's face went through a series of micro-expressions: confusion, worry, and finally, the sharp focus she brought to complex legal puzzles. "Grandma?" Emma said tentatively. "What do you mean, the day you died? You're not dead." Anna Charlotte smiled at her youngest granddaughter, expression that held both tremendous love and unfathomable sadness. "No, sweetheart, I'm not dead. But for 70 years, that's what everyone believed, including, for a very long time, me." She took a deep breath, tasting the weight of truth on her tongue, and prepared to transport her family back to 1954, to a small sharecropper's farm in rural Alabama, where a 3-year-old girl named Anna Charlotte Henderson was about to disappear from the world, taking with her any chance of the family ever understanding why love had always felt so dangerous, so conditional, so much like something that could be withdrawn without warning. The grandfather clock in the hallway began to chime the half-hour, each note falling into the expectant silence like a countdown to revelation. The grandfather clock's final chime faded into silence, and Anna Charlotte closed her eyes, reaching back across 7 decades to find the 3-year-old girl she had once been. When she opened them again, her voice carried a different quality, softer, more distant, as if she were translating memories from a foreign language. "It was 1954, she began, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Spring in rural Alabama, and I was 3 years old, living on my parents' farm with my mama Ruth and my daddy James Henderson. The farm was small, maybe 40 acres of cotton and corn, and we were sharecroppers, which meant we didn't own the land we worked. We owed everything to Mr. Caldwell, who owned the big house on the hill and most of the county besides." Emma shifted on the floor, unconsciously leaning forward. Sophie's defensive posture had melted away entirely, replaced by the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for particularly gripping novels. Maggie sat frozen, her lawyer's mind already racing ahead, trying to piece together the implications of this unexpected family history. "I was a happy child," Anna Charlotte continued, and for the first time since beginning her story, she smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "Curious about everything, always following my mama around the house, asking questions about why the chickens laid eggs and where the sun went at night. I had a corn husk doll named Mary that my mama had made for me, and I carried her everywhere." She paused, her fingers unconsciously mimicking the motion of cradling something small and precious. "I remember the morning light in our kitchen, how it made the dust motes dance like tiny spirits. I remember the way my mama hummed while she cooked breakfast, always the same song, 'In the Sweet By and By.' I remember thinking our little house was the most beautiful place in the world." Reverend Michael leaned forward slightly, his expression gentle but alert. He had heard countless confessions and witnessed many moments of truth-telling. But something in Anna Charlotte's voice suggested this story would challenge even his experienced understanding of human pain. "But there was something wrong in our house," Anna Charlotte said, her smile fading. "Something I was too young to understand but old enough to feel in my bones. My parents would look at me sometimes with this expression, like they were disappointed. Not angry, exactly, but sad. Resigned. Like I was a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit where they needed me to." She moved closer to the window, her silhouette framed against the late afternoon light. "My daddy worked from dawn to dusk, trying to make that farm profitable enough to buy our own land someday. He had dreams, big dreams about owning property and leaving something substantial to his children. But there was a problem with that dream." Anna Charlotte turned back to face her family, and they could see tears gathering in her eyes like storm clouds on the horizon. "Before I was born, my parents had 3 sons. 3 beautiful baby boys who lived just long enough for my daddy to start planning their futures, to imagine teaching them to work the land, to dream about the Henderson name on a deed someday." Her voice caught slightly. "But all 3 boys died in infancy. Pneumonia took the first 2 during a harsh winter. The 3rd lived 6 months before scarlet fever claimed him. The room felt charged with the weight of old grief, tragedy that had rippled across generations without anyone understanding its source." David's face showed recognition, pieces of a puzzle he had never quite been able to solve finally clicking into place. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. "By the time I came along, my parents were desperate," Anna Charlotte continued. "Desperate for a son who would live, who would carry on the family name, who would inherit whatever they managed to build. When I was born healthy and strong, they were grateful, of course. But I was a girl. And in 1951, in rural Alabama, a girl couldn't inherit property the way a son could. A girl would grow up and marry and take her husband's name and leave the family farm behind." Sophie made a small sound of understanding, finally grasping the cruel arithmetic of her grandmother's childhood. Emma's eyes had grown wide with the kind of outrage children feel when confronted with fundamental unfairness. "So they kept trying," Anna Charlotte said simply. "For 3 years they kept hoping for another son. And every month that passed without a pregnancy, every failed attempt, made my existence feel more like a consolation prize. I could see it in the way my daddy's face would fall when I'd run to greet him coming in from the fields. I could feel it in the way my mama would stiffen when I tried to climb into her lap." Maggie's professional composure finally cracked. "Mom, they were grieving. They had lost 3 children. It doesn't mean they didn't love me," Anna Charlotte agreed gently. "But it meant their love came with conditions I was too young to understand and too female to ever meet." She returned to her position near the fireplace, drawing strength from the familiar surroundings. "The crisis came in the spring of 1954. The farm had a bad year, too much rain early, then drought when the crops needed water most. Mr. Caldwell was making noises about finding new tenants, and my daddy was facing the possibility of losing everything he'd worked for. That's when my mama's brother Samuel and his wife Beulah came to visit." Anna Charlotte's voice grew quieter, more controlled, as if she were handling fragile glass. Samuel and Beulah lived about 60 miles away, near Montgomery. They'd been married 15 years and never had children of their own. Beulah doted on me during that visit, and I loved the attention. She brought me a store-bought dress, the first new dress I'd ever owned, and brushed my hair for hours, telling me how pretty I was. The memory seemed to physically pain her, and she pressed a hand to her chest as if trying to hold something inside. I overheard them talking one night, the adults. I'd gotten up for water and heard voices in the kitchen. My daddy was explaining about the farm troubles, about needing to make changes, and Samuel said something that changed everything. She looked directly at Sophie, her granddaughter's face a mirror of the pain she was about to describe. He said, "You know, James, if you didn't have the extra mouth to feed, you might be able to make it work. And Beulah and we've always wanted a child." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Emma's sharp intake of breath and the distant sound of evening birds beginning their songs. Reverend Michael's face showed the kind of carefully controlled emotion that came from years of witnessing human tragedy without being overwhelmed by it. They decided that night, Anna Charlotte continued, her voice steady despite the tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. They decided I would go live with Samuel and Beulah, not temporarily, not until things got better. Permanently, because I was the problem, the extra burden that stood between my daddy and his dream of owning land. David started to rise from his chair, his face stricken with understanding, but Anna Charlotte held up a hand to stop him. She needed to finish this part before her courage failed. They told me I was going on a special trip to visit Aunt Beulah and Uncle Samuel. They packed my few belongings in a flour sack and said I'd have wonderful adventures. I was excited. What 3-year-old wouldn't be? I hugged my parents goodbye, promised to be good, and climbed into Samuel's wagon with my cornhusk doll and my new store-bought dress. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so vulnerable it made Emma start crying in sympathy. I never saw my parents again, Anna Charlotte said simply. And within a week of my leaving, they told everyone in the county that little Anna Charlotte Henderson had died of pneumonia. They even had a funeral service. Reverend Patterson, Michael's predecessor, preached about children being called home to Jesus. The whole community mourned the loss of James and Ruth Henderson's little girl. The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, acrid and suffocating. Sophie was crying openly now, her teenage composure completely abandoned. Maggie sat rigid with shock, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what her mother had just revealed. "That's how I died," Anna Charlotte finished quietly. "At 3 years old, I died to everyone who had ever known me. And in a way, I died to myself too. Because if your own parents can send you away like an unwanted possession, what does that say about who you are? What does that say about whether you deserve to be loved?" The question lingered in the room like a wound that had finally been exposed to air after 70 years of festering in darkness. The weight of Anna Charlotte's revelations settled over the room like dust after an explosion, each family member processing the enormity of what they'd heard in their own way. Emma had moved from the floor to squeeze beside Sophie on the chair, both girls clinging to each other as if trying to anchor themselves against the storm of their grandmother's truth. Maggie sat paralyzed, her hands gripping her teacup so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Anna Charlotte gave them a moment to absorb what she'd shared before continuing, her voice softer now, as if she were afraid of breaking something fragile that remained intact in the room. "The first few weeks with Samuel and Beulah felt like an adventure," she said, settling into the chair David had vacated so he could move closer to the couch, positioning himself where he could reach out to any family member who might need comfort. "Beulah fussed over me like I was a precious doll. She had a real bedroom prepared for me, the first time I'd ever had a room to myself. There were curtains with little flowers, and a quilt she'd made herself, and a shelf for my cornhusk doll Mary." Anna Charlotte's hands moved unconsciously, smoothing her skirt in a gesture that spoke of decades of practicing composure. "But as the days passed and my parents didn't come to visit, I started asking questions. When is Mama coming? When will Daddy take me home?" And every time I asked, Beulah would get this look on her face. Like someone had struck her. She'd hug me tight and say, "This is your home now, honey. We're your family now." Sophie wiped her eyes with her sleeve, her teenage armor completely dissolved. "Did you understand what was happening?" "Not at first," Anna Charlotte admitted. "I was 3. I thought maybe my parents were just very busy with the farm. But children understand rejection in their bones before their minds can make sense of it. I started having nightmares, dreams where I was running through the cotton fields calling for my mama, but she couldn't hear me because I'd become invisible." Reverend Michael leaned forward slightly, his pastoral training recognizing the spiritual dimension of what Anna Charlotte was describing. "How did Samuel and Beulah handle your questions?" "They did their best," Anna Charlotte said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only a deep sadness. "They were good people who found themselves in an impossible situation. Samuel worked for the railroad and picked up odd jobs on weekends. Beulah took in sewing. They had barely enough money for themselves, and suddenly they had a heartbroken 3-year-old to care for." She moved to the window again, her silhouette framed against the gathering dusk. "Samuel was kind but distant. He'd pat my head when he came home from work, but I could see the worry in his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking, the extra mouth to feed, the shoes that would need replacing, the doctor bills if I got sick. I wasn't his responsibility, but here I was anyway. "And Beulah?" Maggie asked quietly, her lawyer's instincts prompting her to gather all the facts even as her heart was breaking. "Beulah loved me the best way she knew how," Anna Charlotte said. "But she was overwhelmed. She'd never had a child. And I wasn't just any child. I was a traumatized little girl who cried for her mama every night and asked constant questions she didn't know how to answer. I remember the day she finally told me the truth." Anna Charlotte pressed her palm against the window glass, her breath fogging the surface slightly. "I was 4 by then, and I'd been asking about my parents for months. Beulah sat me down at their little kitchen table. It was painted yellow, I remember that so clearly, and she tried to explain that my mama and daddy couldn't take care of me anymore, that they loved me but they had to let me go." Emma made a small sound of distress, and Anna Charlotte turned to look at her youngest granddaughter with infinite tenderness. "A 4-year-old mind tries to make sense of that information, sweetheart. And the only conclusion I could reach was that there was something wrong with me. Something so fundamentally broken that even the people who were supposed to love me no matter what couldn't stand to keep me." "That's not true," Sophie said fiercely, surprising everyone with the passion in her voice. "That's not your fault." "I know that now," Anna Charlotte said gently. "But knowing something in your head and believing it in your heart are two very different things. And at 4 years old, I learned the most important lesson of my life. I was too much trouble. Too much need, too much emotion, too much everything. So I decided to become less." She returned to her position near the fireplace, drawing strength from the familiar space. "I stopped crying at night, even when the nightmares came. I stopped asking for seconds at dinner. Even when I was still hungry. I stopped asking questions about my parents and started saying thank you, and please, and I'm sorry for everything, even things that weren't my fault." David's face showed recognition of patterns he'd observed throughout their marriage. Anna Charlotte's tendency to apologize for taking up space, her difficulty accepting gifts or compliments, the way she always insisted she didn't need anything even when she clearly did. "Beulah noticed the change in me, and it broke her heart," Anna Charlotte continued. "She'd try to coax me back to being a normal child, encouraging me to play, to laugh, to ask for things I wanted. But I'd learned that wanting things was dangerous. That needing too much could make people send you away." Reverend Michael spoke softly, his voice carrying the weight of pastoral experience. "Children who experience abandonment often develop what we call, quote, survival strategies. They learn to minimize their needs to avoid further rejection." "Exactly," Anna Charlotte said, gratitude in her voice for his understanding. "I became the easiest child in the world to care for. I never complained, never demanded attention, never made messes. I couldn't clean up myself. I was so grateful for every scrap of affection that I treasured the smallest kindnesses like they were precious gems." Maggie's voice was barely above a whisper. "Is that why you always seemed so distant?" Anna Charlotte finished gently. "Why I never seemed to need anything from you. Why I always acted like everything was fine even when it wasn't." Maggie nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I was terrified of being too much for you," Anna Charlotte admitted. "Even as an adult, even after I was married and had children of my own, I was still that 4-year-old girl who learned that loving someone meant not burdening them with your needs. I thought if I could just be grateful enough, quiet enough, easy enough, maybe I could keep the people I loved from sending me away." Sophie spoke up suddenly, her voice thick with recognition. "That's why I felt like I could never tell you about the cheerleading thing, or about feeling sad all the time, because I didn't want to be too much trouble." Anna Charlotte's breath caught. "Oh, sweetheart, yes, that's exactly why." "And why I became a lawyer," Maggie said slowly, the pieces clicking into place. "Why I had to be perfect at everything. Why I moved away for college and never came back. I thought if I could just achieve enough, be successful enough, maybe I could fill whatever gap I sensed in our family. You were both trying to solve a puzzle you didn't know existed, Anna Charlotte said, her voice breaking slightly. You were trying to heal a wound you couldn't see. The room fell silent except for the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock and the soft sounds of crying. Outside, the last light of day was fading, leaving the living room bathed in the warm glow of table lamps that cast gentle shadows on walls that had witnessed decades of careful conversations and unspoken truths. There's more, Anna Charlotte said finally, about how I learned to navigate the world as someone who didn't quite belong anywhere. About the day I stopped asking if my parents were ever coming back. About how I built a life on the foundation of believing I was fundamentally unworthy of being kept. She looked around at her family. Her daughter, who had spent her life trying to be perfect. Her granddaughters, who were inheriting patterns they didn't understand. Her husband, who had loved her patiently through decades of walls he couldn't quite breach. But I think that's enough for tonight, she said softly. This is a story that needs to be told in pieces, so we can all process what it means. Reverend Michael nodded approvingly. Healing happens in stages, not all at once. Anna Charlotte moved to the lamp and dimmed it slightly, the gesture somehow both ending the evening and promising continuation. Tomorrow we'll talk about how these patterns shaped my adult life, and how they affected the way I raised you, Maggie. How a 3-year-old's survival strategy became a lifetime of keeping people I loved at arm's length, even when I desperately wanted to let them close. As her family prepared to leave, each of them carrying a piece of her story like a sacred burden, Anna Charlotte felt something she hadn't experienced in 70 years, the terrifying, exhilarating lightness that comes from being truly seen. The next evening arrived with the weight of unfinished conversation hanging in the air like humidity before a storm. Anna Charlotte had spent the day moving through her usual routines, tending her small garden, preparing David's medications, organizing closets that were already perfectly organized, but her mind remained focused on the story she needed to finish telling. The previous night's revelations had cracked something open in her chest, and she found herself breathing more deeply than she had in years, as if decades of held breath were finally being released. Maggie arrived early, appearing at the kitchen door while Anna Charlotte was still washing the dinner dishes. Her daughter looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from spending hours processing painful truths. The confident lawyer's facade had been replaced by something more vulnerable, a daughter trying to understand how the mother she thought she knew had been shaped by forces she'd never imagined. I couldn't sleep, Maggie admitted, accepting the cup of coffee Anna Charlotte offered. I kept thinking about what you said, about learning to disappear, and I realized, I think I learned the same thing, just differently. Anna Charlotte dried her hands slowly, considering her daughter's words. Tell me what you mean. I disappeared into achievement, Maggie said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had spent decades running from something they couldn't name. Every perfect grade, every scholarship, every case I won. I thought if I could just be successful enough, maybe I could fill whatever was missing in our family. Maybe I could make you proud enough to, I don't know, be happy. The admission hung between them like a bridge finally being built across a chasm that had existed for 45 years. Anna Charlotte set down her dish towel and really looked at her daughter, not the accomplished lawyer or the competent mother, but the little girl who had sensed her grandmother's hidden sadness and spent her life trying to fix it. Oh, Maggie, Anna Charlotte whispered, I was always proud of you. But I was so afraid of burdening you with my neediness that I never learned how to show it properly. When Sophie and Emma arrived with David shortly after 7, the family settled into their positions from the night before, with the familiarity of people who had shared something sacred. Reverend Michael had graciously declined to return, understanding that some conversations needed to happen within the family's circle alone. The living room felt different now, smaller somehow, more intimate, as if the walls had drawn closer to hold the weight of truth being spoken. Anna Charlotte stood near the fireplace again, but tonight her posture was straighter, more grounded. The telling of her childhood had lifted something heavy from her shoulders, and she faced her family with a new kind of courage. When I was 19, she began, I was working as a nurse's aide at Montgomery General Hospital. I had been living with Samuel and Beulah for 16 years by then, and I had become exactly what I thought the world wanted me to be: grateful, self-sufficient, and completely invisible. She looked directly at David, and her voice softened with memory. "That's when I met your grandfather. He was 22, working construction during the day and taking night classes to become an electrician. He came into the hospital with a broken arm from a job site accident, and I was assigned to help with his care." David's face showed the warmth of shared memory, though Anna Charlotte could see questions in his eyes, pieces of their courtship that had never quite made sense to him finally beginning to find context. "David was different from any man I'd ever met," Anna Charlotte continued. "He was kind without expecting anything in return. He asked me questions about myself, as if my answers actually mattered. When he asked me to dinner, I said yes, but I spent the entire evening waiting for him to realize I wasn't worth the effort." Sophie leaned forward, her teenage cynicism temporarily suspended by curiosity about this version of her grandfather she'd never heard about. "What happened?" "He was patient," Anna Charlotte said simply. "More patient than any human being should have to be. When I wouldn't let him pay for dinner, he didn't argue. He just made sure to suggest places he knew I could afford. When I flinched away from physical affection, he gave me space but didn't give up. When I insisted I didn't need anything, he learned to offer without making it feel like charity." David's voice was gentle when he spoke. "You never told me about your parents. Not the truth." "I told you they died when I was young," Anna Charlotte said, her voice carrying decades of regret, which felt like the truth. "Because in every way that mattered, they had. But even after we were married, even after years of you proving that you weren't going anywhere, I couldn't risk telling you the complete story." She moved to the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. "I was terrified that if you knew the real reason I was abandoned, that my own parents found me so burdensome they couldn't keep me, you might realize they were right. You might decide I was too much trouble." Maggie's voice was thick with emotion. "Is that why you always seemed to be bracing for us to leave? Why you never asked for help, even when you clearly needed it?" "Especially then," Anna Charlotte confirmed. "The sicker David got, the more the girls needed from you. The more I convinced myself that the last thing any of you needed was my problems too. I had spent my entire life learning to be grateful for scraps of affection. I didn't know how to ask for more." Emma, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "But Grandma, that's so sad. We love you. We want to help you." Anna Charlotte turned to her youngest granddaughter with eyes that held both grief and wonder. "I know that now, sweetheart. But when you learn at 3 years old that your needs are too much for people to handle, that lesson gets written in your bones. It takes more than love to erase it. It takes conscious, deliberate work to believe you deserve that love." She returned to face her family directly. "This is how trauma passes from one generation to the next, even when we're trying our hardest to prevent it. I thought if I could just be the perfect mother, never demanding, never needy, always grateful, I could protect you from feeling unwanted the way I had. But that meant you couldn't be fully present," Maggie said, understanding dawning in her voice. "Because being present would have meant risking being vulnerable." "Exactly," Anna Charlotte said. "I was so afraid of being too much that I ended up being too little. I gave you stability and care, but I couldn't give you the emotional intimacy you needed because that felt too dangerous." Sophie's voice was small when she spoke. "Is that why I always felt like I had to be perfect? Like if I messed up too much, something bad would happen?" Anna Charlotte's breath caught. "You felt that?" "Always," Sophie admitted. "Not consciously, but it was like there was this family rule that nobody ever said out loud. Don't need too much. Don't mess up too badly. Don't rock the boat. And I passed that same rule to you without even realizing it," Maggie said, her professional composure finally cracking completely. "My God, Mom. I moved across the state to get away from feeling like I wasn't enough, and then I taught my daughters the same lesson." The room fell into the kind of silence that comes when fundamental truths are finally being spoken aloud. David reached for Anna Charlotte's hand, and for the first time in their marriage, she didn't pull away from comfort offered in front of others. "The worst part," Anna Charlotte said quietly, "is that I genuinely believed I was protecting you. I thought if I could just love you enough without burdening you with my own needs, you'd be safe from the kind of rejection I experienced. Instead, I taught you that love was conditional on being easy to manage." Reverend Michael's words from their phone conversation earlier that day echoed in her mind. The opposite of abandonment isn't just staying, it's showing up fully, with all your needs and flaws and humanity intact. "I robbed you of the chance to love me completely," she continued, "because I was too afraid to let you see me completely. And in doing that, I robbed you of the chance to feel completely loved yourselves." Emma got up from her position on the floor and moved to hug her grandmother, her 14-year-old arms wrapping around Anna Charlotte with fierce determination. "We can fix this," she said simply. "We can learn how to do it better." Anna Charlotte held her granddaughter close, feeling tears she had been holding back for decades, finally beginning to flow freely. "Yes, sweetheart, we can. But first, we all need to understand exactly how deep these patterns run, so we can choose to do something different." She looked around at her family, 3 generations of women who had been unconsciously passing down the same wound, each trying to heal what they couldn't name. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "I want to tell you about the moment I realized these patterns were affecting all of you, and then we're going to figure out together how to break them." As her family prepared to leave, each carrying another piece of understanding about the invisible forces that had shaped their relationships, Anna Charlotte felt something shifting in her chest. The terrifying prospect of being fully known was beginning to transform into something else. The exhilarating possibility of being fully loved. The third evening of Revelations began differently. Instead of the careful gathering of previous nights, the family arrived in overlapping waves of urgency, as if the weight of understanding had become too much to carry separately. Sophie appeared first, letting herself in through the kitchen door with the familiarity of someone who belonged, her backpack still slung over her shoulder from school. She found Anna Charlotte at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. "Grandma," Sophie said, dropping into the chair across from her, "I need to tell you something." Anna Charlotte looked up to find her granddaughter's eyes bright, with the kind of intense clarity that comes from sudden understanding. "What is it, sweetheart?" "I figured out why I feel so scared all the time," Sophie said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Not just about cheerleading or grades or whatever. I mean the deep down scared that feels like I'm always about to be found out as not good enough." Before Anna Charlotte could respond, the front door opened to admit Maggie and Emma, both of them carrying the same charged energy that Sophie had brought. Emma bounced into the kitchen with her characteristic enthusiasm, but even her usual chatter was focused with unusual intensity. "Mom's been crying all day," Emma announced without preamble. "Not sad crying, thinking crying. She keeps saying things like, 'Oh my God, that's why I do that,' and 'How did I never see this before?'" Maggie appeared behind her younger daughter, looking simultaneously exhausted and energized, as if she'd spent the day taking apart a complex machine and finally understanding how all the pieces fit together. Her usual professional composure had been replaced by something rawer, more immediate. "I called in sick to work," Maggie said, settling into a chair with the careful movements of someone who had been emotionally wrung out. "I couldn't concentrate on anything except understanding how deep this goes. I made lists, Mom. Actual lists of every time I chose achievement over connection, every time I moved away instead of moving closer, every time I taught my daughters that love had to be earned through performance." David appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the unusual energy radiating from the women in his family. Behind him, as if summoned by some invisible signal, came Reverend Michael, carrying a covered dish that smelled like his wife's famous cornbread. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Reverend Michael said, setting the dish on the counter. "Maria insisted I bring dinner, and I felt called to be here tonight. Sometimes the most important conversations happen when people are ready to have them, not when they're scheduled." Anna Charlotte felt a surge of gratitude for his presence. Tonight felt different from the careful, structured revelations of the previous evenings. Tonight felt like something was breaking open, and she sensed they would need all the support they could get. They migrated to the living room without discussion, but instead of the formal arrangement of previous nights, they settled into a loose circle on the floor, cushions and throw pillows creating a nest of comfort in the center of the room. Even David lowered himself carefully to the carpet, his arthritic joints protesting, but his determination to be part of this circle overriding physical discomfort. "I want to go first," Sophie said suddenly, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone. "Before I lose my nerve." Anna Charlotte nodded, recognizing the courage it took to speak truth in a family that had spent generations practicing careful silence. Sophie took a deep breath and looked around the circle, making eye contact with each person before speaking. "I've been thinking about what Grandma said about learning to disappear. And I realized that's exactly what I've been doing my whole life, just in a different way." She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them in a gesture that made her look simultaneously older and younger than her 16 years. "I disappear into perfectionism. Every assignment has to be flawless, every test score has to be the highest possible, every activity I join has to result in some kind of achievement that proves I'm worth keeping around." Maggie made a small sound of recognition, but Sophie held up a hand, needing to finish her thought. "But the cheerleading thing broke that system," Sophie continued. "For the first time in my life, I tried really hard at something and failed anyway. And instead of just being disappointed, I felt like I'd been exposed. Like everyone could finally see that I'm not actually good enough, and they'd stop pretending otherwise." Tears were flowing freely down her face now, but her voice remained steady. "That's why I said I wasn't good enough for anything. Because deep down, I've always believed that if I'm not achieving something, I'm not worth anything. And if my own family figured that out, they might decide I'm too much trouble to keep around." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of Emma's sharp intake of breath. Anna Charlotte felt her heart breaking and healing simultaneously as she watched her granddaughter articulate fears she recognized in her own bones. "Sophie," Anna Charlotte whispered, "that's exactly right. And I'm so sorry you learned that from us." Emma surprised everyone by speaking next, her usual exuberance replaced by an unusual solemnity. "I think I learned it too, just differently. I learned to disappear into being helpful and positive and never needing anything. Like if I could just be easy enough and cheerful enough, nobody would ever get tired of me." She looked around the circle with eyes that seemed far too wise for 14. "But sometimes I feel really sad or angry, and I can't let anyone see it because what if they decide I'm not worth the trouble when I'm not being sunshine all the time?" Maggie buried her face in her hands. "This is my fault. I taught you both that love was conditional on performance, just like Mom taught me, just like she learned when she was 3 years old." "It's not your fault," Anna Charlotte said firmly. "It's what trauma does. It gets passed down through families like a genetic trait, but it's invisible so nobody knows they're carrying it." Maggie looked up, her face streaked with tears. "But I could have done better. I could have paid attention to the patterns instead of just repeating them." "How could you pay attention to patterns you didn't know existed?" David asked gently. "How could you heal wounds you couldn't see?" Reverend Michael leaned forward slightly, his pastoral training guiding him to ask the question that would help the family move forward. "What do you see now that you couldn't see before?" Maggie wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. "I see that my drive to be perfect wasn't just ambition, it was terror. Terror that if I wasn't exceptional enough, the people I loved would realize I wasn't worth keeping. So I moved away for college and built this successful career and created this controlled life where I could manage all the variables." She looked directly at Anna Charlotte. "But I also created distance from you, Mom, because your emotional unavailability felt familiar but also painful. I thought if I could just achieve enough, maybe I could earn the kind of love that felt secure. Instead, I taught my daughters that they had to earn love too." Anna Charlotte felt something shifting in her chest, a sensation like ice breaking up on a frozen river. "I taught you that love was scarce and conditional because that's what I learned. But David taught me something different." She reached for her husband's hand, and for the first time in their marriage she didn't apologize for the gesture or worry about being too needy. "He taught me that real love isn't something you earn, it's something you accept. But I was too afraid to believe him." David's voice was soft when he spoke. I knew there was something you weren't telling me. Something that made you flinch away from comfort. Something that made you grateful for things that should have been givens. But I thought if I could just be patient enough, consistent enough, you'd eventually trust me with whatever it was. And you were right, Anna Charlotte said, squeezing his hand. It just took me 70 years to get brave enough to let you see the parts of me I was sure would make you leave. Sophie looked around the circle with something approaching wonder. So we're all carrying the same wound. We're all afraid of being too much for the people we love. Yes, Anna Charlotte said simply. And we've all developed different strategies for trying to manage that fear. But none of our strategies actually work, because they're all based on the false premise that love has to be earned rather than freely given. Emma spoke up suddenly, her voice bright with possibility. But now that we can see it, we can choose something different, right? We can learn to believe we're worth loving just because we exist, not because of what we do or achieve. Reverend Michael smiled at the wisdom of the youngest member of their circle. That's exactly right, Emma. Healing begins with recognition. Once you can see the patterns that have been controlling your lives, you can choose to break them. Maggie looked around the circle with something approaching hope. So what do we do now? How do we unlearn 70 years of believing love is conditional? Anna Charlotte took a deep breath, feeling the weight of decades lifting from her shoulders like morning mist burning off in sunlight. We practice. We practice asking for what we need. We practice accepting love without feeling like we have to earn it. We practice being fully present with each other, even when it feels scary. She looked at each member of her family in turn, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in her life. And we forgive ourselves for all the years we spent protecting each other from a love that was actually strong enough to handle the truth. As the evening light faded around them, the family remained in their circle on the floor, no longer carrying individual burdens but sharing a collective understanding that promised to change everything that came next. The recognition that had emerged from their circle conversation the night before seemed to have awakened something in the family that couldn't be put back to sleep. Anna Charlotte woke before dawn with an unusual sense of energy, as if her body was finally catching up with a decision her heart had made days ago. By the time David stirred beside her, she was already dressed and sitting by the window, watching the morning light paint their familiar street in shades of gold and possibility. "How long have you been awake?" David asked, his voice still rough with sleep. "Since about 4, Anna Charlotte admitted, turning to face her husband of 52 years. "I keep thinking about what happens next. We've opened this door, but now we have to walk through it." David sat up in bed, studying her face with the careful attention he'd learned to pay to her moods over the decades. "You look different," he said finally. "Lighter somehow." "I feel different," she said, surprised by the truth of it. "Scared, but different. Like I've been holding my breath for 70 years, and I'm finally remembering how to exhale." When Reverend Michael called at 8 o'clock, Anna Charlotte wasn't surprised. She had sensed the previous evening that their conversation was approaching a crucial juncture, the point where recognition needed to transform into action. "I've been thinking about your family," he said without preamble, "about the courage it took for all of you to speak truth last night. But I'm also thinking about what comes next. Recognition is just the first step." "I know," Anna Charlotte said, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. "But I don't know how to begin. How do you heal something that's been broken for 70 years? "The same way you break it," Reverend Michael said gently. "One moment, one choice, one act of courage at a time. Would you be open to trying something different tonight? Something more intentional than just talking?" By 6 o'clock that evening, Anna Charlotte's living room had been transformed. Reverend Michael had arrived with supplies that seemed almost ceremonial in their simplicity: writing paper and pens, small white candles, and a wooden bowl that had belonged to his grandmother. The furniture had been rearranged to create a more intimate space, and the lighting was softer, more conducive to the kind of vulnerable work they were about to attempt. When the family gathered, there was a different quality to their energy. The urgency of revelation had been replaced by something more grounded, a sense of purpose that came from understanding not just what was broken, but how they might begin to repair it. Tonight, we're going to do something different, Reverend Michael explained as they settled into their circle. We're going to move beyond understanding the patterns and begin actively changing them. But first, I want each of you to think about what you need to say that you've never been able to say before. He placed the wooden bowl in the center of their circle, its smooth surface worn by generations of use. This bowl has been in my family for over 100 years. It's held everything from Sunday soup to baptismal water to the tears of people learning to grieve. Tonight, it's going to hold your words, the ones you've been too afraid to speak. Anna Charlotte felt her breath catch. She had spent 3 days telling her story, but she understood intuitively that this was different. This was about moving beyond the facts of what had happened to her toward the feelings she had never allowed herself to express. Who would like to begin? Reverend Michael asked gently. Anna Charlotte surprised herself by speaking first. I would. She reached for one of the pieces of paper, her hands trembling slightly. There are things I need to say to my parents. Things I've carried for 70 years without ever giving them voice. As she began to write, the words flowed from her pen with an urgency that surprised her. To James and Ruth Henderson, you were my parents, and you sent me away because I wasn't what you wanted. For 70 years, I have carried the belief that I was too much trouble, too much burden, not enough value to be worth keeping. But tonight, I want to tell you that what you did was wrong. Not just sad or unfortunate or a product of your circumstances. Wrong. You took a 3-year-old child who loved you and trusted you, and you abandoned her because she couldn't solve your problems for you. I forgive you because I understand the desperation you felt, but I also need you to know that your choice wounded not just me but my daughter and her daughters. Your belief that love was conditional on usefulness has echoed through 3 generations of women who learned to make themselves small and grateful and invisible. But we're breaking that pattern now. We're learning to believe we're worthy of love just because we exist. We're learning to take up space without apologizing for it. We're learning that our needs matter, our feelings matter, our very existence matters. You couldn't see my worth, but that was your limitation, not my lack. Your daughter who survived, Anna Charlotte asterisk. As she finished writing, tears were streaming down her face, but they felt different from any tears she had cried before. Not tears of shame or grief, but tears of liberation. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the wooden bowl. Sophie reached for paper next, her 16-year-old hand moving with surprising certainty. To the part of me that believes I have to be perfect to be loved, you've been protecting me since I was little, but you've also been lying to me. You made me believe that my worth depends on my achievements, that love is something I have to earn through performance. But watching Grandma's courage these past few days has shown me something different. I am not my grades, I am not my accomplishments, I am not my mistakes. I am a person worthy of love simply because I exist. The cheerleading thing hurt because I thought it meant I wasn't good enough. But the truth is, not making the team doesn't change my value as a human being. I'm going to practice believing I'm lovable even when I fail. I'm going to practice asking for help when I need it. I'm going to practice taking up space without apologizing for it. Thank you for trying to protect me, but I don't need you anymore. Sophie Emma's letter was shorter but no less powerful. To my family, I've been trying to be sunshine all the time because I thought that was my job. I thought if I could just be happy and helpful and never need anything, you would want to keep me around. But that means you've never really known me, because sometimes I'm sad or angry or scared. I want you to love all of me, not just the easy parts. I want to be able to cry when I'm hurt, and complain when things are unfair, and ask for comfort when I'm scared. I want to stop performing happiness and start actually feeling it. I love you all too much to keep pretending I'm someone I'm not. Emma Maggie's letter took longer, her legal training making her choose each word carefully. To the mother I thought I had to be. You were born from my fear that I wasn't enough, so you made me try to be everything. You convinced me that if I could just achieve enough, control enough, perfect enough, maybe I could earn the kind of love that felt secure. But in trying to be the perfect mother, I became the distant one. I taught my daughters the same lesson I learned, that love is conditional on performance. I passed down the wound I inherited, without even knowing I was carrying it. I'm ready to stop performing motherhood and start actually living it. I'm ready to be vulnerable with my daughters, to ask for help when I need it, to admit when I'm struggling, instead of pretending I have everything under control. I want my girls to know they're loved for who they are, not what they achieve. I want them to see that real strength comes from authenticity, not perfection. I'm done being the mother I thought I should be. I want to be the mother I actually am. Maggie David's letter was simple but profound. To my wife of 52 years, I have loved you through your silence, but I want to love you through your truth. I want you to ask me for things you need. I want you to let me comfort you when you're hurting. I want you to stop apologizing for taking up space in our marriage. You are not too much. You never were. You are exactly enough, and you always have been. Your patient husband, David Valdi. Finally, Reverend Michael added his own words to the bowl. To this family, you have shown me what courage looks like. You have reminded me that healing is not a destination, but a daily choice to choose love over fear, truth over safety, connection over protection. May you remember that you are worthy of love not because of what you do, but because of who you are. May you practice receiving love as freely as you give it. May you know that your story, all of it, even the painful parts, is sacred. Your friend in faith, Michael *. As the last letter was placed in the bowl, Reverend Michael lit a candle and set it beside their collected words. These letters represent your commitment to change, he said softly. They are witnesses to your choice to break patterns that have controlled your family for generations. He looked around the circle, meeting each person's eyes. Now comes the real work. Every day you'll have choices: to fall back into old patterns or to practice new ones, to hide your needs or express them, to apologize for existing or to celebrate it. Anna Charlotte reached for David's hand, then for Sophie's, until the circle was connected by touch as well as intention. I want to practice something right now, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. I want to practice asking for what I need. She looked around at her family with eyes that were finally unafraid to be seen. I need you to know that I love you, not carefully or conditionally, but completely. And I need you to help me learn how to receive that same love in return. The room filled with the sound of agreement, of commitment, of a family choosing healing over hiding. Outside, night was falling, but inside Anna Charlotte's living room, something new was being born. The possibility of love without conditions, truth without shame, and belonging without performance. The wooden bowls sat in their center like an altar, holding their words and their promises, a tangible reminder that some wounds, no matter how deep or old, could still be healed when people found the courage to choose wholeness over hiding. 3 months after the night of letters and promises, Anna Charlotte stood in her kitchen on a brilliant October morning, preparing breakfast for a house that felt fundamentally different. The same morning light streamed through the same lace curtains, but everything else had been transformed by the daily practice of choosing courage over comfort, truth over safety. She hummed while she worked, an old hymn David had taught her years ago that she'd never felt free to sing before, when happiness felt like something that could be taken away at any moment. The sound of laughter from the front porch drew her to the window, where she found Sophie and Emma engaged in what appeared to be a spirited debate about whether the old oak tree's leaves were more orange or red. It was the kind of argument that would have sent both girls into careful silence 3 months ago, each afraid that any conflict might somehow threaten their belonging. Now they argued with the comfortable intensity of people who trusted that disagreement wouldn't lead to abandonment. They sound different, David observed, appearing at her elbow with the quiet grace he'd perfected over decades of marriage. He handed her a cup of coffee, a small ritual that had taken on new meaning since Anna Charlotte had begun practicing the radical act of accepting care without feeling obligated to earn it. We all sound different, Anna Charlotte said, accepting the coffee and the gentle kiss he pressed to her temple, gestures that no longer made her stiffen with the fear of being too needy. Do you think it's real, this change? David's smile held 52 years of patience finally being rewarded with the intimacy he'd always hoped for. Look at them, Anna Charlotte. Really, look. She followed his gaze to the porch, where Sophie was now reading something aloud from her phone, while Emma listened with the kind of attention that suggested genuine interest rather than polite performance. 3 months ago, Sophie had been a girl who believed her worth depended on perfect grades and flawless achievements. Now she was someone who had started a peer support group at school for students struggling with anxiety and perfectionism, using her own story to help others understand that their value wasn't contingent on their accomplishments. The transformation hadn't been immediate or linear. The first few weeks after their healing ceremony had been marked by what Reverend Michael called the stumble period, moments when old patterns reasserted themselves with surprising force. Sophie had panicked over a B+ on a chemistry test, convinced that the grade somehow negated all the progress she'd made. Emma had spent an entire afternoon apologizing for being sad about a friend's birthday party she couldn't attend, as if her disappointment was a burden too heavy for the family to bear. But each stumble had become an opportunity to practice new responses. Instead of reassuring Sophie that the grade didn't matter, Maggie had sat with her daughter's fear and helped her separate her worth as a person from her performance as a student. Instead of rushing to cheer Emma up, Anna Charlotte had held space for her granddaughter's sadness, validating the disappointment while affirming that all feelings were welcome in their family. "Grandma!" Emma's voice called from the porch, bright with excitement. "Come see what Sophie's reading." Anna Charlotte made her way outside, still marveling at how natural it felt to be summoned by her granddaughter's enthusiasm rather than their crisis. Sophie looked up from her phone with the kind of pride that came from genuine accomplishment rather than desperate achievement. "It's an email from Mrs. Henderson," Sophie explained, referring to her English teacher. "She wants to nominate my essay about family secrets for the state writing competition. But that's not the best part," she said. "3 other students have come to her office this month, asking for help with anxiety and perfectionism, and they all mentioned my presentation to the support group as their inspiration." Anna Charlotte felt a familiar warmth in her chest, but this time, it wasn't tinged with the anxiety that had once accompanied any attention her family received. She had learned, slowly and with great effort, to celebrate their successes without fearing that happiness was a precarious state that could be revoked at any moment. "I'm proud of you," she said simply, words that 3 months ago would have been carefully qualified with conditions and caveats. Now they stood alone, an offering of unconditional recognition that Sophie accepted with the growing confidence of someone learning to believe she was worthy of praise. The sound of Maggie's car in the driveway interrupted their moment, but instead of the hurried efficiency that had once characterized her daughter's arrivals, Anna Charlotte heard the unhurried rhythm of someone who no longer felt obligated to manage every moment of family time with professional precision. Maggie emerged from the car looking tired but satisfied, carrying a paper bag that smelled suspiciously like fresh donuts, the kind of spontaneous indulgence that the old Maggie would have criticized as inefficient or unhealthy. She hugged her daughters with the unself-conscious affection of someone who had finally learned that love expressed freely was love multiplied, not depleted. "Emergency donut delivery," Maggie announced, settling onto the porch swing, with a contentment that would have been impossible during her years of constant motion. "I was driving past Morrison's Bakery and realized I wanted to do something nice for my family just because I love them, not because anyone had achieved anything special or needed cheering up." The old Anna Charlotte would have protested the extravagance, would have insisted that donuts weren't necessary, would have somehow found a way to make herself smaller in the face of such generosity. The new Anna Charlotte accepted a chocolate-glazed donut with genuine gratitude, and bit into it with the pleasure of someone who had finally learned to receive gifts without calculating what she owed in return. "How was your morning?" Anna Charlotte asked, settling beside her daughter on the swing that had become their family's informal therapy office over the past 3 months. "Difficult but good," Maggie said, a phrase that had become shorthand for the complex work of unlearning decades of emotional patterns. "I had a partner meeting where I actually disagreed with the senior partner about a case strategy. And instead of backing down or presenting 17 backup arguments to justify my position, I just stated my professional opinion and let it stand." Emma looked up from her donut with the kind of frank curiosity that had replaced her former careful cheerfulness. "Did he listen to you?" "He did," Maggie said, and Anna Charlotte could hear the wonder in her voice. "He actually said my approach was more ethical than his original plan. 3 months ago, I would have spent the entire weekend researching additional support for my position, convinced that I had to prove my worth through exhaustive preparation. Yesterday, I went home at 5 o'clock and read a novel." These small victories had become the cornerstone of their healing, moments when family members chose authentic response over performed perfection, when they allowed themselves to be seen in their full humanity rather than their carefully curated acceptability. David had started sharing his worries about his health instead of protecting Anna Charlotte from them, trusting that his needs wouldn't burden her beyond her capacity to care. Anna Charlotte had begun asking for help with household tasks instead of martyring herself to the ideal of effortless competence. But perhaps the most significant change had come in their Sunday dinners, which had evolved from careful performances of family harmony into genuine gatherings where conflict and affection coexisted naturally. Last week, Sophie and Emma had argued about music choices for the meal, their disagreement escalating into the kind of sibling conflict that would once have sent both girls into apologetic retreat. Instead, they had worked through their differences with the messy honesty of people who trusted that love could withstand disagreement. "Speaking of difficult but good," Sophie said, pulling her legs up onto the porch railing with the casual comfort of someone who no longer felt obligated to maintain perfect posture. "I want to tell you all something that happened at school yesterday." The family's attention focused on her with the quality of engagement that had replaced their former anxious hovering. They had learned to listen without immediately trying to fix, to witness without rushing to reassure. "You know how I've been talking in the support group about family patterns and generational trauma?" Sophie began, her voice carrying the confidence that came from having a story worth telling rather than a performance worth maintaining. "Well, yesterday this girl named Jessica came up to me after the meeting and told me that our conversations helped her realize why she's so afraid of disappointing her parents." Sophie paused, seeming to gather her thoughts, and Anna Charlotte marveled at her granddaughter's growing comfort with being the center of attention without needing to entertain or achieve. "Jessica's parents are divorced, and she's been living with her mom, but her dad keeps promising to spend more time with her and then canceling at the last minute. She thought if she could just be more interesting or successful or whatever, maybe he'd actually show up. But listening to our family talk about conditional love helped her realize that his absence isn't about her not being good enough. It's about his inability to be present." Maggie leaned forward, her professional instincts engaged, but tempered with the emotional availability she'd been practicing. "How did that feel, knowing your story helped someone else?" "Scary at first," Sophie admitted. "Like, what if I gave her the wrong advice? What if sharing our stuff somehow made things worse for her family? But then I realized that's the same pattern. Worrying that I'm too much, that my impact on others is something I have to control perfectly." She looked around at her family with eyes that held both vulnerability and strength. "So I told her what Reverend Michael told us, that healing happens when people recognize they're not alone in their struggles. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just witness someone else's pain without trying to fix it." Anna Charlotte felt a surge of recognition that had nothing to do with pride in achievement and everything to do with love for the person Sophie was becoming. "That's exactly right, sweetheart. You gave her the gift of being seen." "Which is what you gave all of us," Emma added, her 14-year-old wisdom cutting straight to the heart of things as it often did. "When you told us about being sent away, you weren't trying to fix anything. You were just letting us see you." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Reverend Michael, who had taken to stopping by on Saturday mornings for what he called pastoral visits, but which felt more like family check-ins. He carried his usual offering, a thermos of coffee and whatever baked goods his wife Maria had deemed necessary for their spiritual and physical well-being. "I can hear the laughter from the street," he said, settling into the empty porch chair with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had become genuinely part of their family constellation. "How are the new foundations feeling?" It was a question he asked regularly, his way of acknowledging that the work they were doing required constant attention and intention. Healing, they had all learned, wasn't a destination but a practice, a daily choice to respond to life from love rather than fear. "Stronger," David said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed the family's transformation from the unique perspective of having loved them through both their hidden pain and their emerging wholeness. "But different than I expected." Reverend Michael raised an eyebrow, inviting elaboration. I thought healing would make everything easier, David continued. But in some ways, it's made things more complex. When everyone was performing their roles, there was a predictability to it. Now that we're all being authentic, there's more conflict, but also more genuine connection. Anna Charlotte nodded, understanding exactly what her husband meant. We argued more in the past 3 months than we did in the previous 3 years. But the arguments feel different. They're about real differences of opinion rather than who can be the most agreeable. Conflict in service of connection rather than conflict that threatens belonging, Reverend Michael observed. That's actually a sign of a healthy family system. Emma, who had been listening with the focused attention she brought to all adult conversations these days, spoke up suddenly. I think I understand what Grandpa means about things being more complex. Like, last week when Mom cried in front of us about the divorce being hard, that was scary because I'd never seen her cry before. But it was also good because I realized she trusts us enough to be sad around us. Maggie reached over to squeeze her younger daughter's hand, a gesture that would once have been accompanied by apologies for burdening her children with adult emotions. Now it simply stood as acknowledgement and gratitude for Emma's insight. The crying thing has been big for all of us, Sophie added. Like, Grandma cries now when she's happy or sad or frustrated, and at first it worried me because I thought crying meant something was wrong. But now I think it means something is finally right, like she's letting her feelings exist instead of hiding them. The observation was astute enough to make Anna Charlotte pause and consider how profoundly her relationship with her own emotions had shifted. For 70 years, tears had felt like evidence of weakness, proof that she was too much trouble for the people around her. Now they felt like evidence of aliveness, confirmation that she was finally allowing herself to experience the full range of human feeling. I've been thinking about our letters, Anna Charlotte said, referring to the ceremony that had marked the beginning of their active healing work. About how we each wrote about the patterns we wanted to break. I wonder if we've been successful. Marco, what do you think? Reverend Michael asked, his ministerial training guiding him toward questions that would help the family assess their own progress rather than relying on external validation. Anna Charlotte considered the question seriously. 3 months ago, she would have immediately deflected, insisting that the family's healing wasn't about her specifically. Now she allowed herself to take up space in the conversation, to center her own experience without apologizing for it. I think I'm learning to believe I'm lovable, she said slowly. Not just intellectually, but in my body. Like, when David brings me coffee in the morning, I don't immediately calculate what I owe him in return. When the girls call me just to talk, I don't assume they need something from me. When Maggie asks for advice, I don't worry that my opinion will somehow be the wrong burden at the wrong time. She paused, surprised by the truth of what she was saying. I think for the first time in my life, I'm practicing receiving love as freely as I give it. Maggie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, no longer embarrassed by the tears that had become a regular part of their family conversations. I'm learning that control is different from care. I spent so many years trying to manage everyone's emotions, thinking that if I could just anticipate and prevent all the problems, I could keep everyone safe and happy. But that's not actually love. That's anxiety masquerading as helpfulness. She looked at her daughters with eyes that held both regret and hope. Now I'm practicing letting you both have your own feelings and experiences without trying to fix them. It's terrifying but also liberating, for all of us. Sophie nodded enthusiastically. It's like you trust us to be strong enough to handle our own lives. Before, when you tried to fix everything, it made me feel like you thought I was too fragile to cope with difficulty. Now when bad things happen, you help me figure out how to deal with them instead of trying to make them disappear. Emma, not to be outdone by her sister's insight, added her own observation. And I'm learning that I don't have to be happy all the time to be loved. Like, last month when I was really mad about the friend drama at school, I used to think I had to get over it quickly so nobody would think I was being dramatic. But you all just let me be mad until I wasn't mad anymore. Reverend Michael smiled at the wisdom emerging from every member of the family. It sounds like you're all practicing what we call differentiation, the ability to be yourselves within relationship rather than losing yourselves to maintain relationship. David, who had been listening with the quiet attention he'd always brought to family conversations, spoke up thoughtfully. I've been thinking about the difference between patience and enabling. For 52 years, I thought I was being loving by waiting for Anna Charlotte to feel safe enough to share her story. But I wonder now if there were times when I could have created more opportunities for honesty without being pushy. Anna Charlotte reached for his hand with the automatic affection that had replaced her former careful distance. You were exactly the husband I needed you to be. You gave me space to heal at my own pace, and you were there when I was finally ready to accept your love fully. She looked around at her family, these people who had loved her through decades of emotional unavailability and were now loving her through the messy process of learning to be fully present. I think the real change isn't just that we're being more honest with each other. It's that we're being more honest with ourselves about who we actually are versus who we thought we had to be. The afternoon moved forward with the easy rhythm that had become characteristic of their family gatherings, conversation flowing between serious and silly, conflict and connection coexisting naturally. Emma challenged Sophie to a game of checkers that devolved into good-natured arguing about rules. Maggie and Anna Charlotte worked together in the kitchen, their collaboration marked by the kind of comfortable intimacy that comes from no longer having to perform perfect family harmony. When the evening began to gather around them, the family found themselves naturally drawn back to the porch, settling into the configuration that had become their informal council circle. The October air carried the scent of burning leaves and the promise of changing seasons, a reminder that transformation was as natural as the cycles of the earth. I want to tell you all something, Anna Charlotte said, her voice carrying the gravity that had come to signal important family business, about what this healing has meant to me. The family's attention focused on her with the quality of presence they had learned to offer each other. Complete engagement without the anxiety that had once accompanied emotional conversations. 3 months ago, I was convinced that my story was too shameful to share, that the truth about my abandonment would somehow contaminate all of you with the same sense of unworthiness I'd carried for 70 years. She paused, surprised as always by how natural it felt to speak difficult truths in this circle of love. But sharing that story, letting you see the wounded parts of me alongside the strong parts, has taught me something I didn't expect. She looked at each family member in turn, her eyes holding both gratitude and wonder. Shame thrives in isolation, but it can't survive genuine witness. When I told you about being sent away, I thought I was confessing my fundamental unworthiness. Instead, I was finally allowing myself to be known completely. Sophie leaned forward, her teenage defensiveness long since replaced by genuine curiosity. What's different now? I mean, the facts of what happened to you haven't changed. The meaning has changed, Anna Charlotte said immediately. For 70 years, my abandonment meant I was too much trouble to be loved. Now it means I survived something terrible, and still managed to build a life of service and love. The same story, but completely different significance. Reverend Michael nodded approvingly. That's what we call reauthoring your narrative. You're not changing what happened, but you're changing how you understand what it means about you. And it's changed how I understand all of you, Anna Charlotte continued. Maggie, your drive for perfection isn't evidence that you're neurotic. It's evidence that you were trying to heal a family wound you couldn't even see. Sophie, your anxiety about achievement isn't proof that you're weak. It's proof that you inherited a sensitivity to rejection that actually makes you more compassionate toward others who struggle. Emma, your tendency to be the family sunshine isn't fake cheerfulness. It's a genuine gift for finding light in difficult situations. She stood up, moved by an impulse to physically embody the truth she was speaking. We're not broken people who need to be fixed. We're wounded people who are choosing to heal, and there's a crucial difference. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of recognition, each family member absorbing the revolutionary idea that their struggles might be sources of strength rather than evidence of inadequacy. So what happens now? Emma asked, her question carrying both excitement and apprehension about the future they were building together. Anna Charlotte smiled, feeling a certainty that had nothing to do with controlling outcomes, and everything to do with trusting the process. Now we keep practicing. We keep choosing honesty over performance, connection over protection, presence over perfection. We keep believing that we're worthy of love, not because of what we do, but because of who we are. She looked up at the darkening sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear with the promise they had offered every night for all of human history. And we remember that healing isn't a destination, it's a way of traveling through life. Together. As the family began to gather their things and prepare for the evening's end, Anna Charlotte felt the deep satisfaction that comes from work well done and love well shared. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice these hard-won truths. New chances to choose courage over comfort. New moments to remember that belonging didn't have to be earned through performance. But tonight, surrounded by people who knew her story and loved her anyway, Anna Charlotte Williams finally understood what it meant to be fully seen and unconditionally accepted. The 3-year-old girl who had been sent away because she wasn't enough had grown into a 73-year-old woman who finally knew in her bones and blood and breath that she was exactly enough just as she was. 1 year to the day after Anna Charlotte first spoke the words, "I need to tell you all about the day I died," she stood in her kitchen at dawn, watching the familiar Alabama sunrise paint her world in shades of gold and possibility. The date, October 15th, had been circled on her calendar for weeks, not with anxiety but with anticipation. Today would mark her 74th birthday, but more importantly, it would celebrate the anniversary of the most important conversation of her life. The kitchen hummed with the kind of purposeful energy that comes from preparing for something significant. David moved beside her with the comfortable choreography of 53 years of marriage, but there was something different in his movements this morning, a lightness that spoke of a man who had finally been allowed to love his wife completely. They worked in the companionable silence that had replaced the careful quiet of their earlier years, this silence born of contentment, rather than the fear of saying too much. "Are you nervous?" David asked, pausing in his task of arranging flowers, chrysanthemums and asters from Anna Charlotte's garden, flowers that had bloomed despite the early frost, testament to resilience and unexpected beauty. Anna Charlotte considered the question as she checked the turkey she'd put in the oven before sunrise. A year ago, the thought of hosting an extended family gathering would have sent her into a spiral of anxious preparation, worried about every detail being perfect, terrified that some inadequacy on her part might reveal her fundamental unworthiness to bring people together. Now she felt something entirely different. Excitement tinged with the kind of nervous energy that comes from anticipating joy rather than dreading judgment. "Excited," she said, surprising herself with the honesty of the word. "And grateful. A year ago, I thought my story was something that needed to be hidden. Today, I'm celebrating it as something that needed to be shared." The sound of car doors slamming in the driveway announced the arrival of the day's first guests, Maggie and the girls, followed closely by Reverend Michael and his wife Maria, who had become unofficial family members over the past year. But Anna Charlotte knew that today's gathering would include faces that hadn't been seen in her home for decades, voices that would speak truths that had been buried alongside her childhood. Sophie and Emma burst through the kitchen door with the kind of energy that had become characteristic of their family interactions. Unguarded enthusiasm replacing the careful politeness that had once marked their gatherings. Both girls had grown visibly over the past year, not just in height but in presence, carrying themselves with the confidence that comes from knowing they're loved for who they are rather than what they achieve. "Grandma," Emma announced, launching herself into Anna Charlotte's arms with the fearless affection of someone who had never learned to ration her love. "Guess what happened yesterday?" Anna Charlotte caught her granddaughter in a hug that she no longer worried might be too much, too needy, too demanding of attention. "Tell me everything," she said, and meant it. "Mrs. Patterson asked me to read my poem about family resilience at the school assembly next week," Emma said, her words tumbling over each other in excitement. "The one I wrote about how families can heal from old hurts if they're brave enough to tell the truth." The poem had emerged from a school assignment about personal heroes, but Emma had surprised her teacher by writing about her grandmother's courage in sharing her story, rather than about any famous historical figure. It was exactly the kind of choice that characterized Emma's growing confidence, selecting authenticity over what was expected, truth over safety. Sophie appeared beside her sister, carrying a manila folder that she handled with the reverence usually reserved for precious artifacts. "And I have something to show you too," she said, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who had learned to celebrate her accomplishments without needing them to define her worth. She opened the folder to reveal a letter on official state letterhead, the kind of correspondence that would once have sent the entire family into performance mode, worried about living up to expectations or maintaining appearances. Now Sophie shared it with the simple pleasure of wanting to include her grandmother in her joy. "I won the state essay competition," Sophie said, her smile radiant with genuine happiness rather than the desperate relief that had once accompanied her achievements. "But the best part isn't the award. It's that the essay is going to be published in a collection about overcoming family trauma. Other teenagers will read about our story and maybe realize they're not alone in carrying wounds they didn't create." Anna Charlotte felt the familiar warmth of pride, but it was different now. Cleaner, simpler, uncompromised by the fear that happiness was a precarious state that could be revoked without warning. "I'm so proud of you both," she said, words that carried no conditions or qualifications, simple recognition of who her granddaughters were becoming. Maggie appeared in the kitchen doorway, carrying a wrapped package and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement that would have been impossible during her years of careful emotional control. The past year had transformed her as visibly as it had the rest of the family. Her professional competence now balanced with personal vulnerability, her drive for perfection replaced by a commitment to authenticity. "Happy birthday, Mom," Maggie said, offering the package with hands that no longer trembled with the fear of giving too much or not enough. "This one is special." Anna Charlotte unwrapped the gift with the deliberate attention she had learned to bring to moments of receiving, no longer rushing through gestures of love as if they were obligations to be discharged quickly. Inside the paper was a leather-bound book, its cover embossed with gold lettering. "The Henderson Williams Family, A Story of Healing." She opened it to find page after page of photographs, documents, and handwritten stories. A complete family history that included not just the sanitized version they had lived with for decades, but the full truth of their journey through trauma and into healing. There were copies of Anna Charlotte's birth certificate, showing her original name as Anna Charlotte Henderson. There were photographs of the farm where she had been born, obtained through patient research and outreach to local historical societies. But most importantly, there were stories. Sophie's essay about generational trauma, Emma's poems about resilience and family courage, excerpts from David's journal, entries he had written over the years as he witnessed his wife's gradual healing without fully understanding its source, letters from extended family members who had carried pieces of the family secret for decades, finally able to share their own perspectives on events that had shaped multiple generations. "How did you—" Anna Charlotte began, her voice thick with emotion. "I spent months tracking down anyone who might have known about our family history," Maggie explained. "Cousins, family friends, church members who remembered Aunt Beulah and Uncle Samuel. People who had carried pieces of your story for decades but had never been invited to share them." She pointed to a section near the back of the book. "And there are letters from some of them who are coming today. People who have been waiting 70 years for permission to acknowledge what really happened to you." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of multiple car doors announced the arrival of the day's most significant guests. Anna Charlotte moved to the front window and felt her breath catch as she recognized faces she hadn't seen in decades. Relatives from Samuel and Beulah's side of the family, people who had known the truth about her abandonment, but had been bound by the same silence that had characterized their generation. There was Samuel's nephew Robert, now in his 80s, who had been a teenager when Anna Charlotte came to live with his aunt and uncle. Behind him came Beulah's niece Margaret, a woman in her 70s who had spent decades carrying guilt about her family's failure to speak truth about what they had witnessed. And walking slowly up the front path, supported by a walker but moving with unmistakable determination, was someone Anna Charlotte thought she would never see again. "Mrs. Ruth Patterson," Anna Charlotte whispered, recognizing the woman who had been her parents' neighbor, the minister's wife who had attended her fake funeral all those years ago. David appeared beside her at the window, his hand finding hers with the automatic comfort that had become second nature to their marriage. "Are you ready for this?" he asked gently. Anna Charlotte took a deep breath, tasting the weight of the moment on her tongue. A year ago, the thought of facing people who had witnessed her abandonment would have sent her into hiding. convinced that their knowledge made her fundamentally shameful. Now she felt something entirely different: curiosity about their perspectives, gratitude for their presence, and a deep readiness to hear the parts of her story that had been held by others. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it completely. The living room filled with the kind of careful energy that marks significant gatherings. People settling into chairs and sofas with the awareness that they were participating in something historic. Reverend Michael moved among the guests with his characteristic grace, making introductions and creating space for conversations that had been delayed by decades of silence. Anna Charlotte found herself face to face with Mrs. Patterson, the woman whose husband had preached at her funeral when she was 3 years old. Up close, she could see the weight that Ruth Patterson had carried for 70 years. The knowledge of a family's deception, the complicity of silence, the burden of witnessing injustice without speaking truth. "Anna Charlotte," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice carrying 7 decades of regret and relief. "I have been waiting my entire adult life for this conversation." They settled together on the sofa that had become the family's unofficial truth-telling space, surrounded by people who had carried pieces of Anna Charlotte's story, like scattered fragments of a precious vessel finally being reassembled. "I want you to know," Mrs. Patterson began, her words carrying the weight of carefully preserved memory, "that I never believed your parents when they said you had died. Ruth Henderson came to me the day after you left, ostensibly to plan your funeral service, but I could see the lie in her eyes." Anna Charlotte felt something shift in her chest, a sensation like ice breaking up on a frozen river. "You knew?" "I knew," Mrs. Patterson confirmed, "and I have carried the guilt of my silence for 70 years. I was young then, newly married to the minister, worried about my place in the community. I convinced myself that it wasn't my business to question what a family chose to do with their child." She reached for Anna Charlotte's hand with fingers that trembled slightly with age and emotion. "But I should have spoken up. I should have insisted on seeing your body before agreeing to preach your funeral. I should have asked harder questions about why a healthy 3-year-old had suddenly died without anyone else in the community becoming ill." Robert, Samuel's nephew, leaned forward from his chair across the room. "Mrs. Patterson wasn't the only one who suspected the truth. My Aunt Beulah wrote to my mother every week for the first year after you came to live with them, and her letters were full of anguish about the situation. She loved you dearly, but she was heartbroken about the circumstances that brought you to their home." He pulled a yellowed envelope from his jacket pocket, handling it with the reverence due to historical documents. "This is one of Beulah's letters from 1955. She wrote, 'Little Anna Charlotte asks for her mama every night, and it breaks my heart that I cannot tell her the truth about why she cannot go home. That sweet child believes she has done something wrong, and no amount of love from Samuel and me seems able to convince her otherwise.'" Anna Charlotte's breath caught as she heard her childhood pain reflected in words written by the woman who had raised her with such patient kindness. "She knew I blamed myself?" "She knew," Margaret confirmed, speaking from her position near the fireplace. "And she spent years trying to help you understand that your parents' decision wasn't about your worth as a child. She used to tell my mother that you were the brightest, sweetest little girl she had ever known, but that you carried a sadness that seemed too big for someone so small." Reverend Michael, who had been listening with the careful attention he brought to all family revelations, spoke gently into the emotion-charged room. "Anna Charlotte, how does it feel to hear these perspectives on your childhood?" Anna Charlotte considered the question, surprised by the complexity of her response. A year ago, hearing these truths might have overwhelmed her with grief for the childhood she had lost, the years of unnecessary shame she had carried. Now she felt something different, a deep sense of completion, as if missing pieces of her story were finally falling into place. "It feels like coming home," she said slowly. "Not to the home I lost when I was 3, but to the truth about what really happened. For 70 years, I've carried the story that I was abandoned because I wasn't worth keeping. Now I'm learning that my abandonment was witnessed by people who recognized it as wrong, that I was loved by Beulah and Samuel in ways I was too young and hurt to fully understand, and that my parents' decision was about their limitations, not my worth." Sophie, who had been listening with the intense focus she brought to all family history, spoke up suddenly. "It's like Grandma said about reauthoring the narrative. The facts haven't changed, but the meaning is completely different. Emma nodded enthusiastically. Like, instead of being the story of a little girl who wasn't good enough to be kept, it's the story of a little girl who survived something terrible and was loved by people who saw her true worth. Mrs. Patterson wiped her eyes with a handkerchief that looked like it had been carried for decades, perhaps in preparation for this very conversation. That little girl grew up to be a woman who spent her life serving others, as a nurse, as a mother, as a member of this community. Her parents' inability to see her value doesn't diminish what she became. David's voice carried the emotion of someone who had loved Anna Charlotte through decades of hidden pain. What strikes me is how many people have been carrying pieces of this story, waiting for permission to share them. It makes me wonder how many other families are carrying similar secrets, how much healing might be possible if people felt safe to speak truth. Robert nodded thoughtfully. After Anna Charlotte's story became known in our extended family, several other relatives came forward with their own experiences of abandonment or family secrets. It's as if her courage to speak truth gave others permission to examine their own buried pain. Maggie looked around the room with the wonder of someone witnessing the power of truth-telling to create connection across generations. That's exactly what happened with Sophie's support group at school. When she shared our family's story, it created space for other students to examine their own patterns of perfectionism and fear of abandonment. Reverend Michael smiled at the wisdom emerging from every corner of the conversation. This is what healing looks like in community. Individual courage to speak truth creates ripples that extend far beyond the original storyteller. Anna Charlotte felt a surge of gratitude for the roomful of people who had gathered to witness and celebrate her journey from silence to truth-telling. But she also felt the weight of responsibility that came with understanding the broader impact of her story. "I want to say something to all of you," she said, rising from the sofa with the dignity that had always characterized her presence but which now carried an additional quality of authority earned through authentic living. "A year ago, when I first told my family about being abandoned, I thought I was confessing my deepest shame. I was terrified that speaking this truth would somehow contaminate everyone who heard it." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of family members and community elders, people who had known her in her silence and were now witnessing her in her wholeness. "Instead, I've learned that shame thrives in isolation but cannot survive genuine witness. When we speak our truth in the presence of people who are committed to loving us completely, the very act of being seen transforms the meaning of our story." Emma bounced slightly in her chair, her 14-year-old enthusiasm unable to be completely contained even in serious moments. "It's like that thing you always say about turning wounds into wisdom, Reverend Michael." Grandma's abandonment became her superpower for helping other people feel less alone. Sophie nodded, her teenage cynicism long since replaced by genuine admiration for her grandmother's journey. "And it taught all of us that we don't have to earn love through performance. We can just be ourselves and trust that we're worthy of belonging exactly as we are." Mrs. Patterson spoke with the authority of someone who had spent decades in ministry, witnessing both human failure and human redemption. "Anna Charlotte, I want you to know that your story has already changed my understanding of pastoral care. For too many years, I watched families struggle with secrets and shame without offering them safe space to speak truth. Your courage has challenged me to create more opportunities for people to be authentically seen." Margaret added her own perspective from her position as a retired social worker. "In my professional life, I worked with dozens of families affected by abandonment and generational trauma. But I never understood the full impact until I heard your story and recognized the patterns in my own family. It's made me more effective in my volunteer work with at-risk youth." Anna Charlotte felt the weight of these testimonials not as pressure to be inspirational, but as confirmation that truth-telling creates healing opportunities that extend far beyond the original storyteller. The 3-year-old girl who had been deemed too much trouble to keep had grown into a woman whose story was helping others understand their own worth. "I have something I want to share with all of you," Anna Charlotte said, moving to retrieve a folder from the kitchen counter. "Something I've been working on for the past month." She returned to the living room carrying pages covered with her careful handwriting, the product of weeks of reflection and composition. I've been writing letters to other women who might be carrying similar wounds. Women who learned in childhood that their worth was conditional, that their needs were burdens, that love was something they had to earn through perfect behavior. She held up the pages, her voice strong with purpose. I want to start a support group at our church for women healing from childhood abandonment and rejection. Not therapy exactly, but a space for sharing stories and practicing new ways of believing in our own worth. Reverend Michael's face lit up with enthusiasm. Anna Charlotte, that's a beautiful way to honor your healing journey by creating space for others to begin their own. David looked at his wife with eyes that held 53 years of love finally allowed to flow freely. You want to do for other women what telling your story did for our family. Help them understand they're not alone in carrying wounds they didn't create. Exactly, Anna Charlotte confirmed. And I want Sophie and Emma to be part of it, if they're willing. Not as leaders, but as witnesses to the possibility that healing can happen across generations. That young women don't have to wait until they're 73 to believe they're worthy of unconditional love. Both girls nodded immediately, their faces bright with the excitement of being included in meaningful work rather than being protected from adult reality. I want to help, Sophie said. My essay about generational trauma could be part of the resource materials. And maybe some of the other students from our support group would want to participate too. Emma's eyes sparkled with possibility. And I could share my poems about family resilience. Maybe we could create a whole collection of stories and artwork about healing from childhood wounds. Maggie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, no longer embarrassed by the tears that had become a regular part of their family gatherings. Mom, this is incredible. You're taking the pain that nearly destroyed you and transforming it into a source of healing for others. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward with the intensity of someone recognizing a divine calling. Anna Charlotte, I want to offer the church's full support for this ministry. And I want to be the first person to sign up as a participant, not just a supporter. At 91 years old, I'm still learning that it's never too late to heal from childhood wounds. The room filled with the kind of energy that emerges when individual healing transforms into collective possibility. Robert spoke about other family members who might benefit from such a group. Margaret offered her professional expertise in group facilitation. Reverend Michael began outlining the practical steps needed to establish an ongoing ministry. But Anna Charlotte found herself focusing on something else. The faces of her family members as they witnessed her transformation from victim to healer, from someone who carried shame to someone who created space for others to release their own. Sophie and Emma looked at her with the kind of admiration that had nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with authenticity. Maggie's expression held both pride and relief, the satisfaction of finally understanding her mother completely. David's face showed the joy of a man who had waited decades to see his wife fully inhabit her own worth. Before we make any more plans, Anna Charlotte said, her voice carrying the authority that comes from hard-won wisdom, I want to say something about what this year has taught me about the difference between healing and being healed. The room grew quiet, sensing that she was about to share something significant. A year ago, I thought healing meant fixing what was broken in me, arriving at some destination where the pain of my abandonment would no longer affect my life. She looked around the room, her gaze encompassing family members and community elders, people who had witnessed her journey from secrecy to transparency. But I've learned that healing isn't about erasing our wounds. It's about changing our relationship to them. She moved to the window, where the afternoon light cast long shadows across the familiar landscape of her neighborhood. I will always be a woman who was abandoned by her parents when she was 3 years old. That fact will never change. But the meaning of that fact has been completely transformed through the act of sharing it with people who are committed to loving me completely. Emma spoke up with the directness that characterized her approach to complex ideas. So healing doesn't mean the bad things didn't happen. It means they don't get to control your whole life anymore. Exactly right, sweetheart, Anna Charlotte confirmed. My abandonment used to be the secret that defined everything about how I moved through the world, how I loved, how I parented, how I understood my own worth. Now it's one part of a larger story that includes survival, resilience, love, family, and the courage to speak truth, even when it feels dangerous. Sophie nodded thoughtfully. It's like what you said about reauthoring our narrative. You're not changing what happened, but you're changing what it means about who you are and what's possible for your life. Reverend Michael leaned forward with the expression he wore when theological insight was emerging from lived experience. Anna Charlotte, what you're describing is the difference between being defined by our trauma and being informed by it. Your abandonment is part of your story, but it's not the whole story. David's voice carried the emotion of someone who had loved his wife through decades of healing he couldn't fully understand until now. What strikes me is how your willingness to be vulnerable about your deepest pain has created more intimacy in our family than 50 years of trying to protect each other from difficult truths. Anna Charlotte returned to her position in the center of the room, surrounded by people who knew her story and loved her anyway. The reality she had spent 70 years believing was impossible. That's the paradox I want other women to understand. The very act of sharing our shame with people who are committed to loving us completely transforms that shame into connection. Mrs. Patterson spoke with the authority of someone who had spent decades witnessing both human suffering and human redemption. In my years of ministry, I've seen that the stories people are most ashamed to tell are often the ones that create the deepest healing when they're finally spoken in safe space. Margaret nodded from her position as a retired social worker. And the wounds we carry in isolation become sources of strength when they're witnessed by community. Anna Charlotte's abandonment has become her qualification for helping other women understand they're not alone in their pain. As the afternoon moved toward evening, the conversation evolved into something that felt more like celebration than processing. Stories were shared about other family members who had benefited from Anna Charlotte's courage to speak truth. Plans were made for the support group ministry, with multiple people offering resources and expertise. But underlying all the practical discussion was a deeper current of recognition, the understanding that one person's willingness to be vulnerable about their deepest wound had created healing opportunities that extended far beyond anything they could have imagined. "I want to close our time together with something special," Anna Charlotte announced as the day's light began to fade. She retrieved a piece of paper from the family Bible, a document she had prepared specifically for this moment. "This is a letter I wrote to my 3-year-old self, to the little girl who was sent away because her parents couldn't see her worth." Her voice carried the strength that comes from speaking truth that has been carefully considered and fully claimed. "I want to read it not just for my own healing, but as a reminder to all of us about the messages we need to hear about our fundamental worth." She unfolded the letter, her hands steady with the confidence that comes from knowing she was exactly where she needed to be, surrounded by exactly the people who needed to witness this moment. "Dear little Anna Charlotte," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I am writing to you from 70 years in the future, when you are a grandmother surrounded by people who love you completely. I want you to know that your parents' decision to send you away was not about your worth. It was about their fear, their desperation, their inability to see the precious gift you were. You are not too much trouble. You are not a burden. You are not a mistake, or a disappointment, or a consolation prize. You are a beloved child of God, worthy of love simply because you exist. The adults in your life cannot see this truth right now, but that is their limitation, not your lack. You will survive this abandonment, little one. You will grow up in the home of people who will love you the best way they know how. You will marry a man who will spend 53 years showing you what unconditional love looks like. You will raise children who will carry your strength even when they don't understand its source. You will become a woman who helps other people feel less alone in their pain. But most importantly, you will eventually learn to believe what I am telling you now. You are enough. You have always been enough. You were enough when your parents couldn't keep you, enough when you learned to make yourself small, enough when you spent decades believing love had to be earned. You are enough now, at 3 years old, crying for your mama. You are enough at 73, surrounded by family who knows your story and loves you anyway. The wound you are carrying will become wisdom. The abandonment you cannot understand will become your qualification for helping others heal from similar rejection. The shame you feel about being unwanted will transform into the authority to tell other people they are worthy of belonging. Hold on, little one. Your story is just beginning, and it is going to be more beautiful than you can imagine. With all my love, your older, wiser, healed self. As Anna Charlotte folded the letter and placed it back in the family Bible, the room was silent, except for the soft sounds of people absorbing the weight of truth spoken with complete authority. Sophie and Emma were crying openly, their teenage emotions unguarded in the presence of such authentic vulnerability. Maggie held her mother's eyes with an expression that conveyed both gratitude and amazement at the woman Anna Charlotte had chosen to become. David's face showed the satisfaction of a man who had waited decades to see his wife fully claim her own worth. But perhaps most powerfully, the extended family and community members who had carried pieces of Anna Charlotte's story for decades were witnessing the completion of a healing journey they had never imagined possible. Mrs. Patterson wiped her eyes with her vintage handkerchief, finally able to release the guilt she had carried for 70 years. Robert and Margaret exchanged glances that spoke of their own family wounds being illuminated by Anna Charlotte's courage. "Thank you," Mrs. Patterson said simply, "for showing all of us that it's never too late to speak truth, never too late to heal, never too late to transform our deepest wounds into sources of wisdom for others." As the evening drew to a close and guests began to make their farewells, Anna Charlotte found herself standing on her front porch, looking out at the familiar street where she had lived for decades but had never felt completely at home until now. The October air carried the scent of burning leaves and the promise of changing seasons, but instead of the melancholy she had once associated with autumn, she felt only gratitude for the cycles of death and rebirth that made transformation possible. Sophie and Emma flanked her on the porch swing, no longer the carefully polite granddaughters who had once visited out of obligation, but genuine friends who had chosen to stay after the official celebration ended because they wanted more time in her presence. "Grandma," Sophie said, her voice carrying the thoughtfulness that had replaced her former anxiety about saying the right thing. "What you did today, sharing your story with everyone, starting the support group, reading that letter to your younger self, it makes me want to be braver about my own life." Emma nodded enthusiastically. "Like, if you can wait until you're 73 to finally believe you're worth loving, maybe I don't have to wait at all. Maybe I can just start believing it now." Anna Charlotte felt a surge of joy that had nothing to do with pride and achievement, and everything to do with love for who her granddaughters were becoming. "That's exactly what I hope for both of you. That you'll learn at 16 and 14 what it took me 7 decades to understand. That your worth is not contingent on your performance, your usefulness, or your ability to make other people comfortable." Maggie appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray of leftover pound cake and the kind of satisfied exhaustion that comes from meaningful work completed. "The house feels different," she observed, settling into the chair that had become her unofficial spot during family conversations. "Like something that was broken has finally been repaired." David emerged from the kitchen, where he had been washing dishes with the contentment of a man who had learned that acts of service could be expressions of love rather than obligations to be discharged. "Not repaired," he corrected gently. "Transformed. The break is still visible, but it's become part of the beauty rather than a source of shame." Anna Charlotte looked around at her family, her patient husband, her accomplished daughter, her courageous granddaughters, and felt the deep satisfaction that comes from work well done and love well shared. But more than that, she felt the particular joy that comes from knowing that the healing she had worked so hard to achieve would not end with her. The patterns of shame and conditional love that had been passed down through generations had been broken, replaced with new patterns of truth-telling, vulnerability, and unconditional acceptance. "I want to tell you all something," Anna Charlotte said, her voice carrying the authority that comes from speaking truth that has been lived rather than simply understood intellectually. "A year ago, when I first decided to tell you about my abandonment, I thought I was taking the biggest risk of my life. I was terrified that speaking my truth would somehow diminish me in your eyes, that you would see me as fundamentally damaged or unworthy of the love you had been showing me." She paused, looking up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed every night of her 74 years, including the night when she was 3 years old and cried herself to sleep in a strange bed, believing she would never see her parents again. "Instead, I've learned that the opposite is true. The very act of sharing my deepest shame with people who are committed to loving me completely has transformed that shame into connection. My abandonment, which I spent 70 years believing was evidence of my unworthiness, has become the source of my authority to help other people understand their own worth." Sophie leaned against her grandmother's shoulder with the natural affection that had replaced her former careful distance. "It's like what Reverend Michael always says about God using our broken places to let the light shine through. Your abandonment became the crack that let your wisdom out." Emma giggled at her sister's theological interpretation, but her laughter was warm rather than dismissive. "I like that. Like, maybe the hard things that happen to us aren't punishments or proof that we're not good enough. Maybe they're just experiences that teach us things we couldn't learn any other way." Maggie's voice carried the wonder of someone who had watched her mother transform from emotional distance to radical vulnerability over the course of a single year. "What amazes me is how your willingness to be seen completely has given all of us permission to do the same. We're not performing family anymore, we're actually living it." David reached for Anna Charlotte's hand with the automatic affection that had characterized their marriage for over 5 decades, but which now carried an additional quality of celebration for the intimacy they had finally been allowed to share completely. 53 years ago, when I married you, I promised to love you for better or worse. But I had no idea that the worse would turn out to be the very thing that made the better possible." Anna Charlotte squeezed his fingers, no longer afraid that accepting comfort might somehow obligate her to provide something in return. "Thank you for waiting," she said simply. "For loving me patiently through all the years when I was too afraid to let you love me completely." As the family sat together in the comfortable silence that had replaced the careful quiet of their earlier years, Anna Charlotte reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she had been a woman carrying a secret so shameful she believed it would destroy her family if spoken. Tonight, she was a woman whose story had become a source of healing not just for her own family, but for an entire community of people learning that their wounds could become wisdom, their shame could become strength, their isolation could become connection. The 3-year-old girl who had been sent away because she wasn't the son her parents needed had grown into a 74-year-old woman who finally understood that her worth had never been contingent on her ability to meet other people's expectations. She was enough, had always been enough, simply because she existed. And that truth, once claimed and spoken and lived, had become a gift she could offer to anyone else who had learned to believe they were too much trouble to be loved. "I love you all," Anna Charlotte said into the star-filled darkness, words that no longer felt dangerous to speak, words that carried no conditions or qualifications, words that simply celebrated the miracle of being fully known and unconditionally accepted. The chorus of "I love you too" that rose from her family felt like a benediction, a blessing, a promise that the healing they had worked so hard to achieve would continue to ripple outward through generations yet to come. And as Anna Charlotte Williams settled into the porch swing surrounded by people who knew her story and loved her anyway, she finally understood what it meant to be truly free. The truth, as promised, had set them all free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. ...